Welcome to Asian Horizon. Today I want to look at the virtual summit between President Biden and President Xi and look at the larger aspects of US-China relations. But before I start, remember to hit subscribe and turn on notifications and you will receive geopolitical videos every week and you'll stay updated. So this week, President Xi and President Biden had their first virtual summit since President Biden took office. They've had two calls earlier this year, but this was their first virtual meeting. So the meeting lasted for approximately 3 hours, and there are a few key takeaways already. First of all, the most important thing is probably that they actually had a meeting. They could sit down, even though it was virtual, but for a few hours and have a conversation. President Biden and President Xi have met before, particularly when President Xi visited the US, when President Biden was then vice president during President Obama's administration. So they know each other, met several times earlier. But now they had a chance to sit down and have a conversation and discuss a range of aspects in the very important bilateral US-China relationship. First of all, President Xi was able to state a range of key positions from the Chinese side. And what is important to note, I think, is that for President Xi to then clearly indicate what are the red lines. Now, we already know the red lines in terms of Taiwan and a range of other issues, but the fact that President Xi could state these red lines, but also make clear China's position, but also explain the larger context, but also China's aspirations for the US-China relationship is important. For President Biden, it was important to also state clearly the US position in terms of Taiwan, in terms of trade and other issues. But again, the fact that they had a meeting, could sit down and discuss over an extended period of time, I think is very important. Since President Biden took office in January, there has been an escalation in US-China relations in many ways. Even some would say more so than during President Trump's administration. So the fact that President Biden now also could clearly state the US position, but that they had a conversation in an amicable atmosphere is a positive step forward. Now, could we expect some kind of transformation of the US-China relationship? No, that's not going to happen. There will be tensions and there will be competition, as President Biden and his administration already stated. And President Xi also understands that there will be competition in the China-US relationship. However, from President Xi's side, it's important also to indicate that if the United States and China could collaborate on a range of issues, then that would also be a win-win, not only for the US and China, but also for the world. The world now confronting large global issues such as climate change, the fight against the COVID pandemic, and a range of other issues require collaboration, require communication and coordination on a global level. And the better the US-China relationship is, the more and the better chances are that we actually can fight these global issues and reach some type of solutions to move forward. However, we shouldn't expect any breakthroughs. There will be many challenges ahead, and the road is going to be rocky in the US-China relationship, I think, for different reasons. Also depends who is going to win the next presidential election in the United States. If President Trump makes a comeback and wins the next election, that is also going to be a challenge for US-China relations. But as we have seen with President Biden, he has also been confrontational in his tone towards China, as has Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan. However, this meeting now, the summit we saw with President Xi and President Biden, set the tone perhaps also for the direction in US-China relations in the year and years to come during President Biden's first administration. Now it remains to be seen how it evolves. China's exports to the US are very high, although not as high as was agreed on in the first trade agreement during President Trump's administration. Nevertheless, China is increasing its exports to the US and probably is going to continue to do so. Therefore, I think going forward, looking at the dynamics in the US-China trade relationship, remains to be seen if the tariffs continue. They probably will for quite some time, unless the US and China may reach a larger economic agreement. Now, going forward, I think there are going to be key hotspots, as we saw with Taiwan recently, that will remain, also depending on what Taiwan's president does and the internal dynamics on the Taiwanese side. However, China is very clear, and President Xi is very clear that while China seeks reunification, it seeks peaceful reunification, and China is patient. Therefore, it is not interested in a war. However, China will defend its interests. And I think it's very important to understand that if Taiwan were to declare independence, and if the US also were to recognize Taiwanese independence, that would be a complete clear line for China, and China would then intervene militarily. And I think it's important not to underestimate China's intention or willingness or capability to intervene militarily in Taiwan if a red line were to be crossed. Now, going forward, I think we should expect some rocky roads. There will be challenges in US-China relations, but I do not expect that we will see a war over Taiwan, not this year and not next year. What will happen in the future, of course, hard to say. We do know from international relations that black swan moments happen. Complete changes in strategic terms do happen. So there will be changes globally. But again, in the US-China relationship, the most important bilateral relationship in the world, I do not foresee a military conflict. And therefore, the President Xi and President Biden summit this week was important. They could sit down, have a conversation, indicate some of their lines, indicate some of their positions, and also goals going forward. Well, thank you so much for joining Asian Horizon. I look forward to see you again. Thank you.